I shut my mouth on it a little bit earlier, thinking that our program was sort of unsettled. But no, I really want to go back to both the papers, and I thoroughly enjoyed listening to both from different perspectives. But I think what struck me was the sort of common thread in your papers, which was really transformations in the notions of war through history and in the contemporary period. And of course, we come to the cutting edge of warfare now in cyber warfare. So that was really fascinating. This notion that this concern that we have with the way in which war, the idea of war has transformed itself, what it affects, and the way it breaks boundaries of certain kinds. So that I think was a very good idea for me to get from both your papers. And I really appreciate the fact that you both had two different kinds of papers and yet you came together on that one. On Mohan's paper, I obviously had a lot of questions. I had some suggestions as well, and I sort of spoke about them earlier. But there are a couple of things that I really want to, I really think that need maybe more attention. Because I think they sort of open up different ways of looking at Sun Tzu and Kautilya, even in a comparative perspective. One is the authorship of the text, and you said in your paper that the authorship of the text has been contested. I mean, was the Arthashastra actually written by Kautilya, or was Sun Tzu's Art of Warfare actually written by Sun Tzu? And so we have these different perceptions of who the authors of these texts were. I'm sort of wondering whether this whole debate on authorship also opens up the question about whether, in fact, even if there wasn't a specific author, let us assume for a moment there wasn't a specific author, then can the authorship be attributed to the culture of the authors? I.e., can the text be seen as a consensus of a strategic thinking at the period in which these texts were codified and then were printed and disseminated to wider publics? Whether it is policymakers or elite publics during that period. And I think that sort of widens for us the discussion on the text itself. If it was if it was an outcome of the political culture of the time, then I think your argument that it contributed to the political culture can be inverted to say the political culture actually contributed to the codification of a strategic framework, right? So we might want to sort of move across that debate a little bit. The other thing, of course, is that I think that we need to free Sun Tzu and Kautilya from their histories, in a sense, okay? And we need to free them in the sense of not looking at them as the texts that are fixed and that speak in a fixed voice. But that actually there has been a transformation of Sun Tzuan thinking, or the Kautilyan thinking, sorry, you said Kautilya is a noun and not an adjective, right? Over time. And that what we see as the strategic core of Sun Tzu, the strategic core of Kautilya, has been reinvented, has been reinterpreted for different times as well. So that, even if Sun Tzu says in his text that deception is a major form of warfare, deception may not be the core that you want to focus on, say, for the 21st century, because to deceive is extremely important. It is really difficult with modern forms of surveillance, okay, and intelligence gathering. So in a sense, I think that the interpretations and the reinventions of this text are very important in understanding, even at a comparative level, how we deal with the texts today. And I guess what I'm saying to you is that we are looking at the texts in the 21st century. You are looking at them today. And in a sense, the history of these texts will bear upon your understanding and interpretation of these texts as well. So I think that's an important thing to look at. And thirdly, I think there has been a lot of sort of beating of the breast in India about the fact that we don't have a strategic culture, we don't have strategic thinking, we don't talk about Kautilya anymore, we haven't done the research on Kautilya. And yet I think if you look at the history of warfare in India itself, I think the fact that we have fought many, many wars over the last millennium itself will indicate to you that nobody was fighting those wars without some kind of strategic concept in mind. Okay? So I think it's important to link any kind of a history or strategic thought to the empirical evidence on the fighting of wars in India. What kind of wars were actually fought? How were they fought? Who fought them? What were the intentions, objectives, and what were the outcomes of these wars? And I think that itself will give us a much stronger foundation for some kind of research in strategic thought in this country. So it's not Kautilya alone, I think, that we should be looking at, but I think marrying the empirical to the text itself in broader ways. That's my takeaway from your paper. Really, that's the questions in your paper. When you read your paper, I thought about, and I sort of, felt, well, these are things maybe I don't know, maybe we should be thinking about them as well, right? On Atma's paper, really, I thoroughly enjoyed it, mostly because I'm listening to a scientist talking about warfare, and I think it takes it out of the fuzzy realm of IR into a much more sort of definite sense of what we mean and where we locate the areas of conflict. So that was very, very interesting to me. But I think the large question really here is how technology shifts geopolitics. Right? We've had revolutions in technology in history, the compass, navigation, etc. And I think they have shifted the locus of international or world power or global power. And I think in one sense, this whole emergence of cyber technology and the way in which it breaks boundaries and territories and democratizes space, at least the potential for democratizing a certain kind of space, also shifts, I think, the geopolitics of our world today. So I think that for me is the big question, but I will just stop.
I totally agree with you. That's why, in the last I said that I kind of, technology is going to push the boundaries.
I think these comments will help to improve the paper and towards when Professor Nimi Kurian. Sorry, according to the program, it was right.
No, that's absolutely all right. I just thought maybe I should clarify. Thank you. Just to follow up on what Madhu said, I think to begin with Anmol's paper on, so I think when I read your paper, I think it'll be, what I came away with is a set of, I think, a bunch of troubling assumptions which really remain uncritically stated. And the reason I say this is when you look at, three questions really. First, I think it goes to, what I'll try to do is to zoom out and step back and look at some of these generic questions which can be, as I said, fraught and shot through with a whole set of, uncritically stated assumptions and biases. So first, I think the troubling question is, or the critical question we need to you could look at when you compare texts across historical time. Never mind the fact that these are classical texts and you're comparing like periods. Why does, it still doesn't, I think we still need to go back to the question about why does the text really, quote unquote, the text get privileged in historical analysis? I think we need to also look at the privileging of tradition in international relations theory. Goes back to the question which was asked about how this relates to IR theory. Goes back to really understanding the privileging of tradition in IR theory, of which, mind you, the text is a crucial critical component. So what is at work here is an attempt really to, and this actually it's not an innocent attempt, it is an attempt to line up, as it were, an entire pantheon of political thinkers across historical time and to form a phalanx, as it were, and to claim an unbroken intellectual lineage. So that is, I think, the more troubling, that I believe is a huge historical jump. And that jump is, again, shot through with huge problems, because what you're trying to do is to go and make surgical strikes and look at similarities across historical time and gloss over and dismiss differences, because the differences are the messy bits you do not want to engage with. So, so that I think is at the fundamental core, the fundamental question that we need to kind of, grapple with, the assumption, uncritical assumption of the text as tradition in IR theory, the stranglehold it has, the how uncritically most of us as scholars and policymakers take that as a given. So that's my first. The second would be to ask a second question leading off from the first would be to ask, what is this really a quest for? What is this a quest of? I think it's a quest for, again, it's a romanticized quest for the quintessential India and China. It's a quest, and in this case, particularly when you look at these two texts, it is a quest to assume that the classical India and China presented the core essence, the corrupted essence of Indian and Chinese strategic culture. Yeah, mythologies of doctrines. So this is where Skinner actually talks about mythologies of doctrines, where he says, where he expresses his anxiety of trying to read an idea back in historical time, and wherein an idea or a concept assumes an identity independent of its evolutionary history. Now that's a very dangerous assumption, and that is precisely the assumption that IR theory time and again makes of these historical of givens of concepts that are timeless and unchanging, whether it is state or sovereignty or power or international systems. So some of that, I think, baggage is what really needs to be peeled, and peeled really severely. So just the final thought on Anmol's paper then is, how does engaging with the history of ideas then help us question or problematize some of these givens? I think it does that. It's a useful lens to employ, because it brings in the critical dimension of historical contingency. It brings in the idea that the evolutionary path of any concept, it was neither inevitable nor unchanging. There was no pure uncorrupted idea that you could kind of borrow across time. So that, I think, offers a very critical corrective to IR theory, which assumes, as I said, this idea, this assumption that concepts could be largely unchanging and sacrosanct, and could be so I think I'll stop there. To Adya, I think I also thoroughly enjoyed your paper, and I think some of what I'll say will be reflected from the abstract that we saw. And since you also said that most of the tenor of your comparative exercise remained through your presentation, so I think I'll flag a few thoughts. And what I would have liked to see more in your presentation, it was the alternative reading of cyberspace that you hinted at, which was a more tantalizing aspect, and that's from a personal researcher's, bias or interest. I thought that was the more interesting dimension where I thought one could push that really, because it's a fertile ground to ask a set of questions about actors, about levels of analysis, about the whole assumption of states being black boxes, in particular in this case India and China being black boxes, and how we need to how if we question that and unpack that, we actually come away with this very interesting, useful insight of disaggregating India and China and rescaling India and China into constituent different scales. So you are talking at once about levels of analysis and about disaggregating India and China, opening up these black boxes. So I'm sorry I didn't see much of that in your presentation because it seemed still shot through with a largely statist. I mean, I know there's only so much you can do in a presentation. But I saw tantalizing, as I said, glimpses of some of these levels and layers that you mentioned. And so here is a bunch of thoughts for you, for you to consider. I think one would be to ask so one way of getting there, to ask some of that, to make that alternative reading of cyberspace really, would be to ask who inhibits the cyberspace. So is it really only states who inhibit the cyberspace, or are there other actors? Of course, you did mention in your presentation. So one of the actors. So who are the missing actors or issues? What are the missing issues and actors which are missing in action when you talk about cyberspace largely today? The citizen, for instance, one, because the cyberspace is not really just at, it's not a systemic level, idea, but it also has a crucial domestic, because as you said, these are porous boundaries. You cannot, these are fungible, so you need to kind of go back and forth and look at how these domains are fitfully heaving and pushing against one another. So that said, I think that's where you're able to, at one stroke, it could mark a discursive shift in how we have theorized some of this, because it actually questions the holy grail of the modern state of the notion of the linear boundary as a divider. So it fundamentally cracks that assumption. So first would be who inhibits that. Second is a more troubling one, because are India-China comparisons only worthy or are to be made only at the systemic level? Because most of these, even your presentation talked about, areas of cooperation and areas where there are difficulties are largely at a systemic level. Are these the only frames in which we can look at it? And also, given your, and this is your abstract mentioned this about the competition versus cooperation one, is that really the only frame that we can look at? How about looking at, and this is resonating with your presentation about the use of technology by states. Never mind that they are going to eventually, perhaps reach a democratizing potential where the states really need to kind of step back and realize the limits of state power. That apart, how technology is used and to what ends, that I think is a crucial question. So, and leading from there is a third question about cyber security. Is that again a security for whom? And largely, uncritically, it is right now, as it's understood, it's largely that of the state, right? But how does that conception of cyber security then affect the security of the citizen? And because when you look at the discourse on cyber security, you see that there is a very clear securitization discourse that accompanies it right through. And what does the securitization discourse do? It allows the state to bring in extraordinary, exceptional politics of creating zones of exception. And by doing that, like for instance, a quick example both from China and India would be how China uses the discourse of victimhood. Very often, as you said, China is projected as this actor who is going ahead and who is the aggressor, who is seen as a villain in the play. But how China is actually actively projecting that it itself is a victim of cyber crimes, and it uses this discourse very effectively to do what? It uses this to fortify the Great Firewall of China. So that's one. And two, again, busting binaries between India and China as the authoritarian versus democratic political systems, which is not very helpful. You see how the Indian state, as you also hinted, is also going into highly intrusive. Look at the Netra surveillance system. It's a highly intrusive internet snooping spy system, which is developed and pushed by the Ministry of Defense. So I rest that point there, and so just a final thought on. So how do we problematize the notion of cyberspace and cybersecurity? And I'm glad, I was happy to hear that when you said that we really need to make the link between governance and security. But that again, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be a fraught kind of twinning. And I say this because how the state's attempt at introducing exceptional politics actually results in the creation of what Agamben would call the neurotic citizen. A citizen who is willing to police and willing to actually submit to the surveillance state. So you see any number of measures in our daily lives where a suspension of civil and political rights and freedoms is not seen as something of an anathema to democratic Indian citizens. We are willing to go through 24/7 CCTVs, friskings, body pat downs. So much of the whole idea of what it then brings is a chilling reality of the proximity of state in our daily lives. So what I'm trying to say is that the state might be pushing this discourse, but the citizen really is also then accepting some of this and then buys into this discourse of anxiety and fear. So at one level it results in a fraying of the state-society compact, but it also results in the citizen itself buying into and becoming, as Agamben said, the neurotic citizen. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very rich feedbacks. Technically, actually, you could have responded, then we could go on and on, but we are already 15 minutes late, and I thank the organizers and the participants and the respected discussants. Only one thing, Kautilya Arshad gives types of yudh. Yudh, not Vijaya. Prakash yudh, Kuta yudh, Dusman yudh. And Dusman is actually, so he explains this is already there. So now it's come in a horrible form. Bio-warfare is the next one. And I was reading an article, the biggest threat of intelligence snooping on US is Israel. It came as a surprise to me. So this is political realism. Humans, unfortunately, and like Toynbee said, we have to get rid of the karma of war which is inherent in us. Till we don't do that, no peace would come. Therefore, Sun Tzu and Kautilya lays like an operation theatre the horrible mankind that we are. And if good statesmen negotiate in UN, I think wars can come to an end. That is the final message. We move for lunch, and thank you very much. Thank you all of you, and thank you JNU for